Sarah, a 30-year-old disabled girl, has spent her youth trying to fit into life and help her family, but in return, all she gets is coldness and alienation from her loved ones. Since losing her ability to move normally, Sarah has been working hard to earn money as a dishwasher. Every little penny she has saved to help her brother Mark pay for rent. But no matter how hard she tried, her presence was still seen as a burden by her sister-in-law Emily and was often the target of harsh, contemptuous words. That rainy night, like a timeline etched in her memory, Sarah fully felt the pain of abandonment. After a heated argument, Emily coldly threw all her meager belongings out into the yard and shouted that the little house had no room for useless people. Shocked by the heavy words, Sarah could only stand still, her shoulders trembling in the bitter cold rain. Her gaze was sad, filled with disappointment, but she didn't resist. She no longer had the strength to argue or hold on to sympathy from her sister-in-law, who had repeatedly shown hatred. And her brother Mark, the only person she hoped would speak up for herself, sat motionless in the corner of the room, avoiding her sister's pleading eyes. It was his silence that was like a knife cut deep into her heart, more painful than Emily's harsh words. Sarah quietly bent down to pick up her old bag and some rain-soaked clothes and walked through the heavy rain. Her legs limped out of the familiar alley, which had been her last refuge. Every step seemed to carry with her sadness her whole life, a life that not only faced the adversity of disability, but also suffered injustice and abandonment from the people she used to call family. But in the midst of the bitter cold and the darkness of the rainy night, Sarah did not allow herself to cry out loud. Tears quietly fell on her pale face, blending into the rainwater that kept falling, as if to erase her weak figure in that dark alley. In the cramped little house in Alley 12, the air was always heavy and gloomy. Family meals are no longer a warm time to reunite, but become a place full of pressure and tension for Sarah. Emily, her sister-in-law, did not hesitate to let go of harsh words. "You just know how to eat. Sit there and dream about what you can contribute to your family?" Emily's sarcastic tones sounded during the times when the whole family sat down to eat, breaking the stifling silence. Sarah, with sad eyes, could only bow her head in silence, trying to endure. She did not protest, did not complain, because in her heart she still wanted to keep a rare bit of peace in the midst of stormy days. In that house, Emily did not consider Sarah a relative. Instead, she treats Sarah like an uncle, even a clingy. The discomfort was evident in Emily's contemptuous eyes whenever she looked at Sarah, even though she knew that Sarah was constantly trying not to become a burden. Every morning, she woke up early, left the house with a faded cloth bag, and handed it all over to her brother as much as she earned. But that contribution was never acknowledged. On the contrary, it only made Emily feel more uncomfortable. In the eyes of her sister-in-law, Sarah's existence was like an indelible stain in this narrow house. With each passing day, Sarah is like a shadow in the house that used to be the safest place she feels. Mark, the brother she loved with all her heart, never dared to speak up. Even when Emily frankly criticized, he just bowed his head silently. His confused hands gripped his chopsticks tightly. Sarah realized that the silence was more painful than any words Emily could utter. The coldness and distance in that house made Sarah always feel redundant, someone who had no place to stand, no attention or protection. Some nights, Sarah would sit quietly by the window, watching the darkness fill the window. The cold wind crept through the doorway, further clarifying the emptiness in her heart. Is poverty a sin? Was she born to be a burden that no one wanted to take? But even so, Sarah still did not complain. Family, to her, had always been the most precious thing, even as that patience made her more and more distant from them. In this stuffy house, she learned to be silent and endure, as if it were the only way to survive. The climax of the conflicts in the small house came on a rainy evening. The pouring rain made the already gloomy space even heavier. Sarah had just arrived home, still drenched from the rain, when she saw Emily standing in front of the door. The cold face of the sister-in-law with eyes full of contempt made Sarah's heart tighten even more. "How long are you going to cling to this house?" Emily was loud, and her tone sounded like a knife. "This house doesn't feed useless people. Go out and find another place. Sarah was silent, her eyes wide open, staring directly at Emily but not saying a word. The rain outside fell incessantly, and the thunder seemed to blend into Emily's shouting, making the atmosphere in the room even heavier. Sarah bowed her head slightly, the drops of water from her hair dripping down the floor. She glanced at Mark, hoping to find support from her brother. But Mark just sat there, his hands still holding the chopsticks tightly as usual, his eyes looking down at the rice bowl, not daring to face his sister's pleading eyes for help. Mark! Sarah called her brother's name softly, her voice trembling. But Mark didn't answer, his silence like a silent refusal. Helplessness was evident in his thin shoulders, but that silence was what made Sarah feel the most pain. She didn't expect that her brother, whom she had trusted the most, would turn his back on her when she needed him most. Emily didn't stop there. She hurried to the door, dragging along Sarah's old cloth bag and some tattered clothes. Those items were thrown straight to the rain-soaked ground outside. Emily pointed to the door, and her voice rang out again. Get out of here right away. Otherwise don't blame me for making a big fuss. Sarah bent down to pick up the cloth bag, her hands trembling in the bitter cold rain. Her face was pale. Her eyes full of disappointment swept over Emily and then stopped on Mark's face. I'm leaving, she said softly. Her voice choked up. I live peacefully with my family. That short sentence was like a sharp cut in Mark's heart, but he still didn't dare to speak. Sarah stepped out of the house, which she had thought would be her last home. The cold rain seemed to blend into the pain in her heart, making each step heavier than ever. The cloth bag in her hand was drenched in rainwater, like her heart was right now, filled with sadness and despair. Outside, darkness engulfed Sarah, and the cold rain soaked her ankles. But deep down in her, that coldness could not be compared to the extreme loneliness she was feeling. Every step Sarah takes away from the house, she knows that it is not only a spatial gap, but also an unfillable abyss in friendship, where she is forever left behind. Sarah walked in the heavy rain, her breath mixed in the mist, making the surrounding space colder and more lonely than ever. The crippled legs walked on the muddy road, forming long marks on the mud. The rain not only erased those footprints but also seemed to drown her unfinished dreams. The old cloth bag in Sarah's hand seemed to be weighed down by the rain and by her own pain. Every drop of water fell on her hair and shoulders, making her feel extremely small in this vast and insensitive world. The road led her through other houses. The lights in each house were like pieces of happiness that she could not touch. Sarah had no destination. Each step is a constant effort to cope with the pain where the legs have worn out over time. She stopped under a small awning, squatting down to avoid the rain. Water dripped down from the tiled roof beside her, making a sound that was repeated like the bitter whispers of life. She hugged the bag tightly to her body as if hugging the last fragments of life. Memories rush back, from the childhood days in her mother's arms to the day her mother died, and even the years of living in the estrangement of her sister-in-law. Sarah's heart tightened at the thought of her last moment in the house, when she called her brother's name but received only a bitter silence. Sarah's tears mingled with the rain, salty on her lips that had turned purple from the cold. Where am I going? She wondered, her voice as small as a fragile breath in the wind. But even she didn't have an answer. She had no money, no shelter, and no one to wait. A thunderous sound rang out, pulling her back to reality. Sarah reached out to wipe away the rainwater, her eyes shining with something like determination, even if it was just a small piece. She couldn't let the cruelty of the world knock her down any longer. The footsteps continued, staggering and slow, but not stopping. Beneath the dark rain, Sarah was a delicate figure trying to cling to what was left of hope. The hope that somewhere, out there was still a place for her. Sarah continued on the cold road, ignoring the bone-deep rain. There were only a few coins left in her pocket. Each of her hurried breaths blended into the bitter air, making the night sky even heavier. When approaching Fook Lock Market, Sarah saw a small awning of a closed stall. She sat down quietly, leaning against the wall to rest. All night, she huddled in her soaked shirt, trying to find some warmth in the cold rain. But before daylight, another light came. Black car lights flashed across the street, shining into the dark corner where she was sitting. The car stopped, and from there stepped down an elegant-looking man, accompanied by 2 policemen. Sarah tried to sit up straight, her eyes intertwined with fear and confusion. The man approached and stopped in front of her. He spoke up, his voice gentle but still solemn. "Excuse me, are you Sarah? You used to live on Anderson Street, didn't you?" Sarah raised her head, her eyes full of vigilance. "Yes, is me. What's wrong?" I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice trembled, somewhat desperate. The man smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, we're not here to arrest you. I'm Jonathan, an attorney from the law firm Richardson and Company. I have an important thing to announce. You are the rightful heir to a large fortune, left by a relative of yours." Sarah's eyes widened, so astonished that she was speechless. Jonathan's words were like unreal echoes in your head. "Inherit? Which relative? I don't understand." "There is no one." Jonathan quietly placed an envelope in Sarah's hand. "These are the papers and the will from Uncle Paul, her estranged cousin. He passed away a few months ago. In his will, he said that for many years, even though he had not been in touch, he had always remembered her. He left the Briarwood mansion and a large sum of money in the bank. It all belongs to you." The whole world seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah was silent, her trembling hands opening the envelope. She read through the papers inside. Her eyes filled with tears as her name was clearly written in it. Her breath choked up, not because of this unexpected property, but because of the memory of her uncle who had taken care of her like her for a short time before the 2 lost contact. "Do you still remember me? But why? I don't even think you're alive." Choked whispers escaped from Sarah's lips. Jonathan bowed politely, as if to show respect. "Your uncle wants to make up for the years you have endured. We have prepared a car to take her to the Briarwood mansion right now. Everything is ready to pick you up." Sarah took the paper in her hand, feeling the warmth creep through the cold pages. A small flash of light flashed in her heart, like a fragile fire that was being rekindled in the cold, dark night. As the car left, Sarah looked through the glass door, each drop of rain rolling long, mingling with her tears. But this time, the tears were no longer just grief, but relief and hope. Fate hadn't completely turned against her. Finally, after long days of misfortune, a new door was opening for Sarah. The Briarwood villa appears splendidly like a dream in the hazy morning fog. It was an ancient house with a mossy red tile roof, huge wooden windows, and a large garden surrounded by white roses. Sarah got out of the car, her legs trembling not only from fatigue, but also from the feeling of being overwhelmed by the superficiality of this place. Jonathan led Sarah through the gate, carefully pointing out every detail that Uncle Paul had prepared for her. "This house is not just a place to live. It contains a story that Uncle Paul wants you to understand. Everything is still the same as it was when he left." Sarah walked into the hall, where the soft light of the crystal chandelier reflected on the wall full of family portraits. She recognized her picture as a child, which was solemnly placed in the right corner. Her heart suddenly throbbed. A nameless nostalgia rushed back. Jonathan handed her a small silver key. "The office on the 2nd floor will give you the answer." He left it all there. Sarah walked slowly up the stairs, each step echoing a deep echo, as if the house wanted to whisper something to her. When she opened the door of her office, a faint scent of oak wafted into her nose, carrying a sense of familiarity. On his desk, among the thick books, was an old leather-bound notebook, next to a sealed envelope. She opened the notebook first. Uncle Paul's italic words appeared, like a whisper. "Dear Sarah, I knew about my difficult life after my parents died, but at that time, I couldn't do anything about it. You are too distant, too shy to enter your life, and you have let me suffer for so many years. But there's one truth you need to know." The trembling words stopped there. Sarah felt like everything around her had vanished, leaving only her and the fragile page. She opened the envelope next to her. Inside was a handwritten paper and some old photos. As it turned out, Her life was not simply unhappiness that came from lack of luck. Uncle Paul revealed that Sarah's parents had previously been deceived by a relative who had misappropriated the family property, pushing the family into poverty. But by the time Uncle Paul found out the truth, it was too late. Her parents had died in an unfortunate accident. His uncle regretted not being able to help them all his life, so he decided to make amends by any means, including spending all the money he earned to give Sarah a future. The more she reads, the more emotional Sarah becomes. The last photo in the envelope is of the Briarwood mansion itself, when it was newly built. In the photo, her parents are standing smiling happily, with a small child in her arms. It is her. 2 rows of tears rolled down, and Sarah closed the photo, carefully placing everything on the table. Now she understands that not only fate has not abandoned her, but also the love of her relatives has never been lost. Everything was kept, just waiting for her to discover. The old questions still didn't have satisfactory answers, but now Sarah no longer felt like she was drifting. She has an origin, a legacy, and a reason to move on. In the midst of a stormy night, a sincere light from the past shone through, illuminating the way for her to go towards the future. Sarah stood quietly in front of the villa, the golden sunset shining on the tiled roof, illuminating the white rose garden that swayed gently in the wind. She slowly walked into the garden, her hands caressing each soft petal. The pain in his heart seemed to gradually dissipate, giving way to a strange sense of relief, as if all the resentment, and hurt had been swept away by time. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath of a familiar scent she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. In the faint light of the evening, Sarah seemed to see the silhouettes of her parents coming from the end of the road leading into the house. They held hands. Their smiles full of love and gentle eyes gave her comfort. "Everything you need, you deserve." As the words whispered in her head, she felt her heart tighten, but no longer in pain. That image, even if only for a moment, was etched into her memory, helping her understand that the love of her family was never really lost. Back at the house, Sarah carefully placed the notebook and photo on the bookshelf, where the soft light of the table lamp shone. She has decided to live here, where it all began, and also where she will build a new life. In the days that followed, Sarah continued to learn more about her family's past through the documents left by Uncle Paul. She discovered that traumatic stories not only contain loss, but also bring with it lessons about resilience and the power of love. One morning, as the sun shone through the doorframe, Sarah sat on a swinging chair in the garden, looking out at the roses in full bloom. Suddenly, a cool breeze blew through, and the petals fell lightly around her as if sending a message. In that moment, Sarah smiled. A smile is not of mere acceptance, but of hope and desire to continue living life to the fullest. Despite the defects on her body, her heart has healed, full of intact emotions. She realized that the painful truth was also a gift. It gave her the strength to face, heal, and love more. Whatever the world was like out there, she knew that she had always carried the love of her parents, Uncle Paul, and this house where she found herself. A small bird flew into the blue sky, carrying her light soul. Sarah looked at it, feeling that her life was now like that bird, free, courageous, and looking forward to the beautiful things ahead.